They told me at first light that a foreign king wished to kneel at our grave, and I did not believe it. I had stood the vigil for 19 years by then, captain of the company that keeps the court of the Nameless, and in all that time no crown but our own had crossed that threshold. The tomb of the unknown of the long war sits in the old cathedral court of Caredon, under a flat slab of gray northern stone with no name cut into it, only 6 words. He gave what no ledger counts. Around it day and night, fair weather and foul, 2 of my men stand the watch in the black and silver of the Vigil company, and they do not move, and they are never alone, and the flame in the iron cresset at the head of the stone has not gone out in 40 years. That is the post. That is the whole of it. So when the steward of the household came to me in the cold antechamber with the message in his hand, I asked him to read it twice, because I was certain I had misheard him the first time. "The sovereign of Ostmark," he said again, slower, as if I were the one who could not credit plain words, "asks leave to honor your unknown soldier, to lay a wreath at the stone, with his own hands, captain, not through an envoy, himself." Ostmark. I let the name sit in the cold air between us. For most of the men under that gray slab, Ostmark had been the country on the far side of the line, the guns that had answered ours across the river marshes for 9 winters of the long war, the reason there was an unknown soldier to bury at all. My own grandfather had gone into the marsh against Ostmark, and had not come home with a name on him either. Half the families in Caredon could say the same. And now, the man who wore that crown wished to walk into our most sacred court and kneel where our nameless dead lay. "He may be refused," the steward said carefully, watching my face. "The king has not decided. He wishes the captain of the vigil to have his say first. It is your court after all, your watch." I have learned in 19 years of standing very still that the first thing a man feels is rarely the thing he should act on. What I felt, hearing that name, was the old marsh cold in my grandfather's letters, the cold that never fully left our family. What I said, after a while, was, "Tell the king I should like to see how the man asks before I tell him how I'd answer." The steward almost smiled. "He thought you might say something of the kind. The sovereign of Ostmark arrives in 3 days. I will tell you what I expected, because I am not too proud to say I was wrong. I expected a performance. I had seen 100 dignitaries pass through the great court for one ceremony or another, and I had learned to read them the way you read whether coming over the marsh. The ones who came to be seen, the ones who came to be photographed, the ones who treated a sacred stone as a fine backdrop for the business of looking solemn. I expected the sovereign of Ostmark to be one of those, a man making a gesture, buying with a wreath some softening of the old hard feeling between our 2 countries, and using my dead men to do it. I told my company as much the night before when I gathered the watch in the guardroom under the cathedral court. There were 8 of us who would stand the ceremony, the 2 on the stone, 4 flanking the approach, and Sergeant Halloway and myself to conduct it. Good men, every one. Lance Corporal Pine, the youngest, was so new to the vigil that his boots still creaked. "Whatever he is," I told them, "whatever he came for, it is not our concern. Our concern is the stone and the men under it. We render the honors of the house. We do not render 1 grain more or 1 grain less for a crown than we would for a charwoman who came to lay a single flower for a son she lost. The honor is for the dead, not for the living who come to see them. Is that understood?" "Yes, Captain," they said all together, the way they say everything. "Pine," I said, because the boy's jaw was tight, "you have something to say." He flushed. "My great uncle's under that stone, Captain, could be. We never knew which way he went. And it's an Ostmark king coming to—" He stopped himself. "Permission to stand the rear rank, sir. I don't trust my face for the front. I have commanded a great many men. The ones who ask to be put where they can do the least harm are usually the ones I most want at my side." "Granted," I told him. "But you'll stand the front rank by the end of this, Pine. I'd put money on it." I did not yet know why I said that. I only knew, looking at the boy's locked jaw, that something in the next 2 days was going to surprise all of us, and I wanted him close enough to see it when it did. That night after the others had gone, I stood the late watch myself, as I sometimes do. I stood at the foot of the gray stone with the crescent flame moving on the old walls, and I read the 6 words I have read 10,000 times. He gave what no ledger counts. And I thought about the marsh, and the line, and the guns on the far side that had a country and a flag, and I supposed, men who had grandfathers too. Men who had also not come home with names. The thing I could not yet name, the thing that would carry the next 2 days, first stirred in me there, in the dark, alone with the flame. The slow understanding that the man under my stone and the men the Ostmark king mourned were not on 2 sides of anything anymore. They were on the same side of the only line that matters in the end, the line between the living and the dead. And the dead do not keep up old quarrels. Only the living do that. But understanding a thing in the dark and being asked to act on it in the daylight, before 2 crowns and the whole watching world, are different burdens entirely. I went to my cot near dawn no easier than before. And when the steward woke me with the word that the sovereign of Ostmark had crossed our border and wished, before any banquet, before any state hall, before he had so much as washed the road off his hands, to come first and quietly to the court of the Nameless, alone but for one aid, to see the stone he meant to honor, I knew the performance I had braced for was not going to come, and I did not yet know what would come instead. He came on foot. That was the first thing that told me I had misjudged him. The state cars were left at the outer gate. The steward had arranged a discreet entrance through the cloister, and the sovereign of Ostmark came through it the way an ordinary mourner comes, coat buttoned against the cold. No retinue, no cameras. One gray-haired aide a pace behind him carrying nothing but a folded paper. He was older than I had pictured. There was a stoop in his shoulders that no portrait shows. He stopped at the arch where the court opens, and he took off his hat, and he stood there a moment looking at the gray stone and the 2 motionless men of my watch and the small living flame, and he did not move to go in. He waited to be permitted. A king, at the edge of another king's grave, waiting at the threshold like a man who knows the difference between his country and this one small holy square of it that was not his to walk into uninvited. I crossed the stones to him. I am not a small man, but I felt small that morning in the cold court before that quiet old king and the weight of what stood between our 2 flags. I came to attention and gave him the honor due his rank, no more and no less, and I said, "Your Majesty, I am captain of the Vigil. This is the court of the Nameless. No one passes the line of the watch without my leave." I expected him to be offended. Kings are not, as a rule, made to ask a captain's leave for anything. But he inclined his head as if I had told him a perfectly reasonable thing, and he said, in our tongue, slowly, with the heavy accent of his own, "Then I ask your leave, Captain. I will not cross until I have it." "May I ask why you have come?" I said. "Plainly, sir. The dead under that stone fell against your country. You will forgive me if I want to know the manner of the honor before I grant the passage of it." The aide behind him stiffened at that. The king did not. He looked at me for a long moment with eyes the color of marsh water, and then he said the thing that turned the whole of it. "My father is under a stone like this one," he said. "In my country, we also have a grave with no name in it for the same war. For 9 winters my country and yours sent men into the same marsh, and the marsh kept some of them, and we could not tell yours from mine when we found them. We buried them where they fell, on whichever side held that yard of ground that month. Some of the men under your stone, Captain, may be mine. Some of the men under mine may be yours. We will never know. The marsh did not keep accounts." He paused. "I am old. I will not see many more winters. Before I go, I wish to stand at this stone and say to your unknown soldier what I cannot say to my own, because I do not know which grave holds my own. I came to mourn a son I cannot find, at the grave of a son you cannot name. That is the manner of the honor, Captain. There is no other in it. I have stood very still for 19 years. I did not move then either. But I will tell you that something behind my ribs went very quiet, the way the court goes quiet at the relief of the watch, when one stillness hands itself to another. My grandfather went into that marsh, I heard myself say. I had not meant to say it. Against your country. He did not come home with a name on him either. The king looked at me, and there was no triumph in it and no calculation, only the recognition of one old grief by another. Then perhaps, he said, we have both come to the same grave this morning, Captain, for the same reason, and only just discovered it. I granted him the passage. I will not pretend the decision was mine alone, or that it was easy. That afternoon I was called before the King of Caradon, my own king, in the small council room where the hard things are decided away from the court. The matter had grown past a single old man at a threshold. The sovereign of Ostmark, having stood his quiet private moment at the stone that morning, had asked through his steward whether he might be permitted to return on the third day and lay a wreath there formally, not in secret, but in the open before both nations. And he had asked one thing more, a thing that had set the whole household arguing since noon. He had asked that our king lay a wreath beside his, at the same stone, at the same hour, 2 crowns at one grave. It cannot be done, said the chancellor, who is a careful man and not a cold one. Sire, half the country lost someone to Ostmark in that war. If you stand shoulder to shoulder with their crown over our own dead, the old men who fought will say you have made a show of their grief to buy a treaty. They will say the dead were used. And if I refuse him, my king said quietly, what do I say to the old men then? That an enemy king came in humility to honor our nameless dead, and I sent him away because the hatred is more useful to me kept warm. He turned to me. Captain, it is your court. You stood at the threshold with him this morning. You have the watch on those men, and you have had it for 19 years, longer than any of us has held our offices. I will hear you before I decide. They all looked at me. I am a soldier, not a statesman, and the room was full of men whose whole craft is the weighing of consequence. But I had stood at the foot of that stone in the dark the night before, and I had understood a thing there that I now had to find the words for in the light. Sire, I said, I have kept that watch 19 years, and I will tell you the one thing I know about the man under the stone, the only thing any of us knows for certain. We do not know his name. We do not know his rank. We do not know his face or his town or whether he was brave or only frightened and unlucky. And because we do not know, we have made him stand for all of them, every man who went into that marsh and did not come back with a name. That is the whole purpose of the nameless grave, sire. It is the one grave large enough to hold everyone's grief, because it belongs to no one, and so it belongs to all. I drew a breath. If it can hold every grief in Caradon, sire, I do not see how it is made smaller by holding one more from across the river. The Ostmark king does not come to take our grave from us. He comes because he has the same wound and no place to lay it. To send him away is to say the grave is ours alone, that grief is ours alone, that the dead chose a side and keep it still. And the dead chose nothing, sire. The marsh chose for them. I have read the 6 words on that stone 10,000 times. He gave what no ledger counts. There is no ledger under that stone, sire. There is no accounting of which uniform, which flag, which side. There is only the giving. I do not think we should be the ones to start in accounting the dead themselves laid down. The room was silent. The chancellor opened his mouth and closed it again. My king looked at me a long moment. Then he said, and the watch, captain, whose hands escort 2 crowns to one stone if it is done, yours. Mine, sire, I said. If you do this, I will stand it myself, and I will tell you now it will be done so that no man who fought in that marsh can ever say his dead were made a show of. It will be done as a watch, not a ceremony. The honors of the house and not 1 grain more. If we do that much, sire, the old men will see it for what it is. A soldier's company knows the difference between a salute and a performance. So do the men who earn the right to be saluted. My king was quiet for a while. Then he rose, which in that room is the end of the matter. 3 days, he said. Tell the sovereign of Ostmark that the king of Caredon will lay a wreath beside his at the stone of our unknown soldier. And tell my captain of the Vigil, he looked at me, and I have served 4 monarchs and never seen quite that look from any of them, that the dignity of it rests in his hands, and I would trust it to no others. I bowed, and walking back across the dark court to my company that night, I understood that I had just talked my king into the hardest watch I would ever stand, and that if it went wrong before 2 nations, it would be my doing, and the dead would indeed have been made a show of, and it would be on me. The grandeur of a thing and the danger of it are the same size. I had forgotten that, arguing so well in the warm council room. The cold court reminded me. The trouble came the next morning, and it came from the men I most respected. They were waiting for me at the outer gate of the court when I arrived before dawn, a dozen of them, old men, some on sticks, one in a chair pushed by his son. They wore the marsh ribbons. I knew several of them by sight. They came to the stone every year on the day of the armistice, stood the morning at the railing, and went away without a word. They were the survivors of the long war, what was left of them, and they had heard what their king had agreed to, and they had come to say their piece before it was too late to unsay it. Their spokesman was the oldest of them, a man named Garrick who had lost a brother and both legs below the knee to an Ostmark mine, and who had, I was later told, walked the last mile to the gate on his sticks rather than be wheeled. He did not raise his voice. The men who have the most cause to shout are often the quietest. "Captain," he said, "you keep our dead. We've watched you do it 20 years, and we trusted you to do it. Now we hear you mean to walk an Ostmark crown up to our stone and let him lay a flower on the men his guns put under it. We've come to ask you, soldier to soldier, not to do it. Send him home. That ground is ours. We paid for it. He's got no right to it, and you've got no right to give it him." A younger man might have argued. I had a great many arguments, the same ones I had given my king, and they were true. But there is a difference between what is true and what a grieving man can bear to hear, and I have learned, late and at cost, that you do not win an old soldier with an argument. You win him by standing where he stands. So I did not argue. I asked him, "Will you walk with me to the stone, Garrick, all of you who can, before the sun's up? There's no one in the court but my watch. I want to show you something, and then I'll do whatever you say. If you tell me to send him home after, I'll go to my king and I'll resign the watch sooner than do a thing the men who fought won't have. You have my word as the captain of the Vigil, which is the only word I've got worth giving." That stopped him. They came. We went in through the cold cloister, the dozen old men and I, the sticks tapping on the worn stones, and we came into the court of the Nameless, where my 2 watchmen stood unmoving over the gray slab, and the small flame burned at the head of it. The old men fell quiet the way every man falls quiet there. The court does that. I led Garrick to the head of the stone. "Read it to me," I said, "the 6 words out loud. I've read them 10,000 times, but I want to hear them from a man who was in the marsh." He looked at me, and then he looked down, and in a voice gone suddenly rough he read. He gave what no ledger counts. "No ledger," I said. "Garrick, when you found your dead in that marsh, the ones too long gone to know, the ones the water had taken the names off of, could you always tell ours from theirs?" He was silent a long time. The flame moved on the walls. "No," he said at last, "not always, not by the end. The marsh took the uniform same as the faces. We buried what we found where we found it, said the words over the lot of them, and hoped the right God sorted it." His jaw worked. "There's an Ostmark lad or 2 under our stones, Captain, like as not. We knew it. We never said it." "You don't say a thing like that to a grieving country." "Then you already know," I said gently, "what I'm going to show you. There may be one of theirs under our stone this very minute. There may be one of yours under theirs, across the river, with their flame on him these 40 years, and an Ostmark widow laying flowers she thinks are for her own. The marsh didn't keep the line, Garrick. We've been keeping it for the dead all these years, and I'm not sure they ever asked us to." No one spoke. One of the old men behind me had begun, very quietly, to weep and was ashamed of it and was let alone. "I'm not asking you to forgive Ostmark," I said. "That's not mine to ask and it's not the king's to grant. I'm asking one thing. When that old man kneels here in 2 days, and he is an old man, Garrick, older than you, who lost a son to the same marsh and can't find the grave any more than you could find your brother, I want you to ask yourself whether you're looking at an enemy or at a man with the same wound. Come to the only stone big enough to hold it. That's all. You said the ground is ours. It is. And a man who owns ground that wholly can afford to let another grieving man stand on it a while. Only a small country keeps a great grave to itself." Garrick looked at the stone a long time. Then he looked at me, and his old eyes were wet and steady at once. "My brother," he said, "would have shared his last dry match with an Ostmark lad in that marsh and shot him an hour later if the order came, and grieved him both ways. That's what the marsh was. You young ones don't know." He drew a breath. "Don't make a show of it, Captain, that's all we ask. If it's done quiet like a watch, if it's not for the cameras and the treaty men." He stopped. "We'll come. We'll stand at the rail. We won't make trouble. But if I see 1 minute of it that's for the living and not the dead, I'll stand up on these stumps and I'll say so, and the whole world can hear me. If you see 1 minute of it that's for the living and not the dead," I said, "I'll stop it myself. You have my word again." He took my hand. His grip was a young man's still. "Then we're square, Captain," he said. "Mind you keep it." When they had gone, I stood a long while at the foot of the stone, and I understood that the ceremony I had to build now was not a ceremony at all. It was a watch with 2 kings in it, and the difference between those 2 things, between a salute and a performance, between honor rendered and honor spent, was the whole of what hung on the next 2 days. Garrick would be at the rail. So would the marsh ribbons, and the cameras of 2 nations, and the treaty men who wanted this to mean a softening of borders, and the old men who would not forgive having their grief softened for anyone's border. I had to find the one way to do it that served the dead and not one living soul in that court, and I had 2 days. I built it the way I would build any watch, from the stone outward. I would not have it announced. There would be no music, drums make a parade of a thing, and this was not a parade. There would be no speeches at the stone. Words spent a silence, and the silence was the honor. The 2 kings would not enter together abreast, like rivals matched for a photograph. That was the very thing Garrick feared. They would come as mourners come, one and then the other, and the order of their coming I worked out with a care I have given few things in my life. I went to the sovereign of Ostmark's steward, and I told him plainly how it would be, and I told him it was not negotiable, and I half expected to be overruled by men above me who wanted the grand symmetrical image of 2 crowns side by side. But the Ostmark king, when it was put to him, sent back a single line through his aide that I have kept. He said, "The captain is right. We do not come as 2 kings, we come as 2 sons. Let him arrange it as a watch, and I will follow his watch as if I were the youngest man in it." I read that line twice as well. The morning came gray and still, the way the best of our northern mornings come, with a low cold light through the high cathedral windows and no wind to trouble the flame. I had the court cleared and held since before dawn. The marsh ribbons were let in first by my own order, before the press, before the treaty men, before any official of either crown. Garrick and his dozen took their places along the rail nearest the stone, the place of honor, where the families stand. I had a chair carried in for the man who could not stand and set it at Garrick's right hand so he could see everything. That was deliberate. Whatever happened at that stone, I wanted the men who fought to be the closest living souls to it, nearer than any king, nearer than any camera. If grief had a front rank that morning, it would be theirs. My watch took its posts, the 2 on the stone, motionless as they have been for 40 years, 4 of us flanking the approach, the path the mourners would walk. Sergeant Halloway at the head of the path to receive the wreaths, and the rear-ranked Lance Corporal Pine among them, his jaw still locked, his boots still creaking, his gray tuncle perhaps under the very stone he guarded. I had not moved him to the front. I had told him I would 2 days before, but I had not, and he did not know why, and neither, quite, did I, except that I felt the morning would do it of its own accord, and that a thing like that should not be ordered when it can be earned. The king of Caradon came first, my king. He came alone, but for me, on foot, in the plain dark coat he wears for mourning and not the robes of state. That, too, we had agreed, against the advice of men who wanted the cameras to have their crowns. He came up the path between my flanking watch, and the marsh ribbons came to attention as well as old broken bodies can, and he stopped at the head of the stone. Sergeant Halloway placed the wreath in his hands, gray marsh laurel, no royal device on it, the same wreath any family lays, and my king stepped to the foot of the gray slab and laid it down with his own hands, slowly, the way you set down something you do not want to wake. Then he stepped back 1 pace and bowed his head and was still. I gave the command for the honors of the house. My watch brought their arms to the present, the slow honor, the long honor, the one we render to the crown and to the dead and to nothing else on this earth, and held it. The court was so quiet I could hear the flame. And then I gave the command to stand at ease, and my king stepped to the side, not away to the rail, to stand among the marsh ribbons rather than apart from them. He stood at Garrick's left hand, level with the old men, and he did not say a word to them, and they did not bow to him, and that was right. There are places a king is only another mourner, and he had the grace to know that this was one of them. Then, alone, on foot, in his own buttoned coat with his hat in his hands, the sovereign of Ostmark came up the path to our nameless grave. I will tell you what I watched, because I had the best vantage in the court, and I have had 2 years since to be sure of what I saw. I watched Garrick at the rail. I had told my men that if the marsh ribbons turned their backs, and they had the right, I had not asked them to do otherwise, we would render the watch all the same and let the turned backs be part of the truth of it. I watched the old man's hands tighten on the rail as the Ostmark king came on. I watched his jaw set. The enemy was walking up to his brother's grave, and every year of the marsh was in the old man's face. And then I watched the Ostmark king reach the head of the stone, and stop, and read the 6 words cut in it, "He gave what no ledger counts." And I watched the old king's face come apart very quietly, the way a face does when it finds, in a foreign tongue on a foreign stone, the exact and only thing it has been unable to say in its own. He did not take the wreath at once. He stood and read the words again. Then he turned not to the cameras, not to my king, not to the treaty men. He turned to the rail, to the row of marsh ribbons, to Garrick and the broken old men who had fought his country for 9 winters. And he found, somehow, the oldest among them, and he looked straight at Garrick, an enemy looking an enemy in the face over the grave of all their dead. And the sovereign of Ostmark bowed to him. Not the inclination of a head that kings give. A full bow, from a stooped old back that it must have cost him, the bow a man gives to someone he has wronged and cannot mend. He held it a long moment. Then he straightened and he said in our tongue slowly, the only words spoken aloud at that stone the whole morning, "I am sorry for your brother. I have a son out there too. Forgive an old man for coming to your grave to find him." Garrick did not move for what felt like a year. Then the old man let go of the rail and he came to attention on his sticks, swaying, his son half rising to catch him and waved off, and Garrick, who had walked a mile on stumps to beg me to send this king home, brought his old hand up in a salute, to the Ostmark crown, over his own brother's grave. A salute, soldier to soldier, the only language the two of them had ever truly shared, given at last across a line that the marsh had erased 40 years before, and that only the living had kept drawing since. And down the whole rail, one by one, the marsh ribbons came to attention and saluted with him. The man in the chair could not rise. He saluted from the chair, his hand shaking. 12 old enemies, saluting an old enemy at one grave in one silence, while 2 crowns stood among them as only 2 more mourners, and let the soldiers have the moment, because the soldiers had earned it and the kings had not. I have stood the vigil 21 years now. I have seen a great deal at that stone. I have never seen anything like the silence in the court when an Ostmark king, his hat against his chest and tears on a face that had ordered armies, finally took the gray marsh laurel from Sergeant Halloway's hands and knelt on the cold stone, an old man with a son he could not find, and laid his wreath beside my king's at the foot of our nameless grave. 2 wreaths, 1 stone, no device on either, no flag, no ledger, nothing to say which crown laid which. Just 2 old men's grief, set down side by side, indistinguishable, the way the marsh had made them indistinguishable 40 years before. I gave the command for the honors of the house a second time. And as my watch brought their arms to the slow present, I saw, out of the side of my eye, a movement in the rear rank that should not have been there. Lance Corporal Pine had stepped forward, out of his rank, without an order. The boy who had asked to stand at the back so no one would see his face. He had come forward, past the men ahead of him to the front rank, to stand over the stone where his great uncle might lie, and he had brought his own arms up to the present alongside the rest, and his face was not locked any more. His face was wet and open and unashamed, and it was rendering the honor with everything in him, to the dead of 2 countries at once, and I let him stand it. I had told him 2 days before that he would stand the front rank by the end of this, and I had not known how right I was, and I have never been gladder to be right about anything in my life. There was a treaty in the end. The treaty men got their treaty. But I will tell you a thing about that treaty, because I was there for the part of it that mattered, and the part that mattered did not happen at the table. When the honors were done and the kings had withdrawn, it was not the chancellors who spoke first. It was Garrick. The old man went, on his sticks, the length of the cold court to where the sovereign of Ostmark stood quietly with his aide, and the 2 old enemies stood together a long while over by the cloister arch, 2 men who had each lost what the marsh took, and no one heard what they said, and no one had the right to. But I saw the Ostmark king take Garrick's hand at the end of it in both of his, and I saw Garrick let him, and I saw 2 old soldiers part as men who had, very late, agreed that the war was over, not the treaty's war, which had ended 40 years before on paper, but the other one, the one that had gone on burning in the survivors long after the guns went cold. That war ended in the cold court that morning, between 2 old men over a grave, and the paper the chancellor signed a month later only wrote down what the soldiers had already decided. The alliance the treaty men wanted, the deepened bond between 2 crowns it held. It holds still, 2 years on, harder than any treaty in our history. And when the diplomats are asked why it has lasted where so many sealed by lesser feeling have failed, they speak of clauses and of mutual interest and of the careful work of careful men. They were not in the court that morning. I was. I will tell you why it holds. It holds because it was not built between 2 crowns. It was built between 2 graves, and ratified by the men who had earned the right to ratify it. And a thing built on the dead of both sides is the one thing the living of both sides cannot easily tear down. You can repudiate a treaty signed in self-interest. You cannot, so easily, repudiate the morning your grandfather saluted his old enemy over your nameless dead and meant it. We did not bind 2 countries that day. We let 2 countries stop drawing a line the dead had never asked us to draw. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference, and it is why the bond has held. The sovereign of Ostmark died the next winter, as he had thought he might. His steward sent word, and with it a single line in the old king's own shaking hand, written, they said, not long before the end. It was addressed to me. It said, "Captain, I never found my son, but I knelt at his grave at last in your country, and your old soldier forgave me for it, and that is more than I came for and all that I needed. Keep the watch. It is the only border worth holding. I have kept it, I keep it still. I am old now myself, older than I ever thought to be, and the boy Pine is a sergeant of the Vigil and will have my company when I lay it down, and he is the best of them. And the marsh ribbons are nearly all gone, Garrick last of them, 2 winters back, and we stood the full honors of the house over him, and there were ostmark flowers on the rail, sent across the river by a country that had once been the marsh on the far side. There is a second wreath laid at our nameless stone now, every year on the day, by an ostmark hand. We do not stop them. We render the watch over it the same as over ours. There is no ledger on it. There never was. People ask me, sometimes, the meaning of that morning, the 2 crowns at the one grave, the thing that turned an old enmity. They expect me to speak of kings, of statecraft, of the great matters that great men decide. But I stood the watch, and I will tell them what a watchman knows that the great men do not. The dead laid down the quarrel the day the marsh took their names. We are the ones who kept carrying it. And all any honor ever does, the truest honor, the kind worth standing 40 years in the cold to render, all it does is set down, at last, the weight the dead set down long before us, and we're waiting with more patience than we ever showed for the living to put down too. 2 crowns, 1 grave, no ledger. That is the whole of it, that is the watch.